So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about a topic that I write about pretty much constantly, which is transit planning and transportation planning, and this whole very fraught conversation that we have about where to put new transit lines, how do you get the most bang for your buck? Why do you put a line here and not there? And these are really difficult questions, and there are lots of ways of analyzing these questions today. And and I'll talk a little bit about the past. I think that we kind of overthink a lot of what we do at the moment. When you look at how transit infrastructure was put into the city 100 years ago, it wasn't subject to the same kind of analysis. But I think that the people who were the municipality and the private organizations that were putting it in were sort of feeling their way out and kind of got it right a lot of the time. So anyway, so the title of this talk is the Work in Transportation Infrastructure, an Uneasy Relationship. And it becomes more uneasy as time passes, and I think Craig sort of kind of hinted at that in his talk. But I just want to begin with a sort of a little bit of a kind of an assessment of the present, and then I'll talk a little bit about the past. One of the defining problems of transportation investment and transit infrastructure in Toronto at the moment is that people work where transit isn't, and this issue, that kind of discrepancy has become increasingly pronounced over a period of several decades, and shows really no sign of abating. And this is a study. This data is from a study by a guy named Ian Dobson, who's a commercial real estate consultant. And he wrote a report for the Canadian Urban Institute, which has got the former transportation minister's attention in no small way. And so what he's done is basically look at where the jobs are, where the transit is, and where the transit isn't. And I think that these statistics are really fascinating because they kind of give you a sense of of what's happening here, and particularly in the office sector. So. I'm going to kind of pick it up where Craig left off. I mean, there's been a long-term decline in industrial work in Toronto, and like many global cities, the employment growth is in both the high end and the low end of the service sector, right? So accountants, lawyers, financial people at the high end, and at the low end, retail clerks, people working in the food services industry, and so on. So there's been that growth, a lot of growth in institutional employment, hospitals, government agencies, and so on. So there's been a lot of there's a great demand for office space, and this is interesting that there's 100 million square feet of office space, and accounting for 500,000 jobs that are not connected to the region's transit network at the moment, and that trend is expected to continue for several decades, and it's a worrisome trend because obviously people have to get to work, and they have to take alternative ways of getting to work, which is to say they use their cars. So a few more discouraging indicators. I did a profile of the 401 a few years ago for Reader's Digest of all places, and I came across a really interesting data point. Well, the most interesting is that the 401 has the dubious distinction of being the busiest highway in North America, including the New Jersey Turnpike, including highways in metropolitan Los Angeles. There are places where it's 20 lanes plus wide, and the rush hour volumes in 1970 are equivalent to what you see on the highway now late at night, at 11 o'clock at night, or really early in the morning. That's an indication of the reliance on the cars in the Greater Toronto area. The Board of Trade last year, or the year before, did a commute time study and found that Toronto's commute times were among the highest in North America. We have these very severe reverse commutes that if anybody has to, go north on 404 or 400 in the morning, will understand that there's a, huge amount of employment growth in, around, in Markham, in Vaughan, in Richmond Hill, and these are not areas that are accessible by transit in any way. So you see a lot of, you see this huge demand for residential development and for residential property in the city of Toronto. People are commuting out. And just as an aside, one of the, a lot of condominium developers are interested in spots close to highways because, and often in locations that are both close to highways and transit, the corner of Bayview and Shepherd being a great example, because you could market it and say, okay, well, it's close to the subway, but it's close to an on-ramp. And finally, there's this question of the productivity loss in the city. So the estimate is anywhere from $6 to $11 billion a year of lost productivity across the Greater Toronto area, and then that doesn't include, the amount of, missed appointments and, arriving late for your kids' performance in the school play and so on. So there's a significant cost. Downtown, you have okay. So there are kind of a couple of things going on. We have like a very overtaxed transit infrastructure in the downtown area, and that's as a result of this amazing amount of office space employment in the core of the city, and so you have a very overtaxed subway system. So anybody who uses the Yonge subway line will know in the morning that you're waiting for several cars to go by before you can squeeze yourself on. This is a big issue for transit planners at the moment. They're trying to figure out how do you get that subway line to haul more people into one of the major job creation areas in the whole city. The path network is in many ways an adjunct to the transportation infrastructure in the city. And if you go through the path network, there are lots of great stores and food courts and so on, but it is transportation infrastructure, and it serves as a sort of an extension of the subway line, of the GO lines that come into Union Station. Also overtaxed, very, very crowded in the morning. So those are the conditions downtown. There are related issues that have to do with the development patterns in the city. So you have this enormous amount of intensification in areas in the downtown core. So this is a photo of Liberty Village. I don't know if you can see it. Liberty Village has an amazing amount of density, not a lot of open space, is highly reliant on the King streetcar, and not a lot of other transit options for people who are going into the city. So it's an example of what happens with the thrust of development and investment in the city, and what happens when you don't connect that kind of investment to transit investment. So there's one of the things that people who write about transit policy a lot deal with is this whole walking and chewing gum issue, and the left hand not knowing what the right hand is up to. So one of the symptoms I just mentioned is is intensification that's not linked to investment in transit and transportation infrastructure. So there's a reliance on the type of streetcar service on King and Queen, which is becoming increasingly congested, difficult to use. There's a lot of discussion about doing away with street parking. How do you deal with the fact that a lot of commuters, people who are traveling to the office district downtown, rely on that transportation infrastructure, but it becomes increasingly inefficient. I know people who will get off, they don't bother riding the King car through the core because it's actually faster to walk. There's the lack of of cycling infrastructure. So Lydia Chow a couple days ago came out with her promise to increase the cycling infrastructure, and I hope she does it. I've been covering City Hall for a long time, and every mayor promises to do it except for the current mayor, and it somehow doesn't seem to happen. But cycling infrastructure is part of the commuting infrastructure, and it should be seen as such. Anyone who's watched what happens on the College Street cycling lanes in the morning knows that it's a major commuter thoroughfare. It's not very wide. It's got a lot of traffic on it, and we could use more of that, but we don't seem to build too much of it. So I want to go back a little bit now to where we started and how we got to where we are at the moment. So Toronto is very much defined by the railways that came through beginning in the 1850s, and there was the linkage between the railway infrastructure, the port infrastructure that led to an enormous amount of industrial employment in the center of the city, and it created a lot of the wealth that built Toronto by the 1890s. It created this boom in the city that sort of propelled Toronto into a much more economically central position. The areas in close proximity to the railways had a lot of working class housing, everything from working class homes to apartments and to buildings that had accommodation for shared labor, or for laborers who lived several people in one apartment or one house. So there was and I think as Craig mentioned, I mean, there was in that time you walked to work. It wasn't that far. The factories were downtown. The working class neighborhoods were very close by. So proximity and a lack of options sort of determined the way people used transit and not used transit, but the way they transported themselves to work. So then there's this period that, so from the 1890s to the 1920s, there's this enormous surge in the population of the city and this huge boom in Toronto's economy. So I think this is always an interesting statistic. In the course of 30 years, we went from 181,000 people in the city to over 500,000. So that's a threefold increase. And if you can imagine that since the city of Toronto in the early 2000s adopted the new Toronto official plan, the city's population grew from about 2.2, 2.3 to 2.7-ish. So it added about 600,000 people. And there are places where you could feel that additional population quite in a very pronounced way. So here is a city that more than tripled in size. There was a lot of outward pressure. There was growth north, west, and east. The municipality was annexing smaller municipalities, Brackendale, West Toronto, North Toronto, Moore Park. There was a whole series of annexations that occurred in the early part of the 20th century. As the city grew outward, and there was pressure to provide municipal services to these outlying areas. The streetcar service, as I think you probably heard earlier, was run on a franchise basis to a private company that was much loathed. And by the 1910s, there was ample evidence that the private streetcar service was very poor. The cars were continually breaking down. There were accidents. There were injuries. The company that held the franchise was very reluctant to extend its service to the newly developed parts of the city. So the city of Toronto began to take on the responsibility of building new transportation lines to accommodate this outward growth. So now, before I get to the outward growth, I hope you can see this map. This is a great map. This is a 1915 map showing rush hour, and it's a mapping of rush hour. And if you can't see it, there's this beehive thing in the middle of the map, which is the office district, and it shows where where trips originate, and it clearly shows that at that time, in the middle of this boom period, a lot of people were still traveling to the center of the city to work in the industrial areas down near the port and the office districts that were growing up in the center of the city. So that was 1915, but at the same time, there was this expansion of the industrial areas sort of outside the core in newer areas like West Toronto. And so this is a slide I think, Craig, you had in your presentation. But you see this growth of industrialization in the Massey-Harris lands, for example, in West Toronto, in the Junction, driven by expansion of the railway lines. The Grand Trunk line went in there. There was the new plants grew up. A lot of industry sort of settled in that area because there was the proximity to the railways, which was their lifeblood. And so, as we heard in the last presentation, I mean, there would have been a need to get workers from the areas where they lived to these new sort of outlying employment districts. And so that's the evolution that we see in the transportation infrastructure of the city. So one of the things that comes up a lot in any discussion about transit construction is the chicken and the egg problem, or the build it and will they come problem. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about the St. Clair West line is that it was an example of infrastructure that went in advance of development. It drove development. And I think I'm not saying anything you haven't heard several times. And I love this picture on the right. That's the streetcar line going in. That's just east of Oakwood Avenue. And you could see actually in that photograph the Oakwood Collegiate. So the school board was building schools well in advance of a neighborhood being there. The streetcar line was going through, farmland essentially, and it took only, a matter of a decade for the development of this streetcar suburb to really kick in. And you see, on the right, you see a photograph of a much more sort of urbanized kind of environment in almost exactly the same location. And it's houses and it's stores, and it's a place where people live, not primarily where they work. Now, there was some industry in this area prior to the arrival of the streetcar. There was a foundry just on the site of the Witchwood Barns. There were some brick gravel yards. So there was employment around here, but there was also this growing employment at the west end of the streetcar line and at the west end of the city. And this becomes a place where the transit infrastructure of the city has to accommodate the workers who are traveling to the stockyards, to the General Electric plant, and in great numbers by this point. So in the 20s and 30s, there's a lot of employment going into that direction. This map, I hope you can see, shows by 1926 you have a lot of streetcar infrastructure servicing the West End and the Junction area. And so the St. Clair line ends at Caledonia, but there's a line up on Davenport. There's the line that goes up Dundas West. So there are car barns on Lansdowne. So there's a lot of transit infrastructure has accumulated around the West End, and that is a reflection of the fact that this area had become an employment area as well as a residential area, but further to the west. And I'll just very quickly say that in the post-war period, we see this sort of disaggregation between transit infrastructure and employment. And so the industrial development moved out of the city. There was the transportation infrastructure became very road-based. You had a new planning orthodoxy, the separation of uses, commercial, industrial, residential. So people were not encouraged to live near their employment areas, and so you create the foundation for the problems that we face today, which is that most people don't work anywhere near where the transit infrastructure takes them, and that's it's a profound and existential problem for Toronto, for Greater Toronto, and not just for Greater Toronto. This is an issue for all major metropolitan areas in North America and elsewhere, really. And so the big question that faces decision makers is how do you justify the investment, building a subway out to Scarborough, building a subway up to Vaughan, and not being sure that people will use that very expensive transit infrastructure to travel to work. They'll travel from that area down to employment zones like York University and the office district, but is it a two-way service? And there's lots of evidence that the transit infrastructure that was built until the Second World War was in many ways a two-way service and served these industrial zones. So anyway, I'll stop there and let you continue with your presentation.